Imagine for a second that you are 50 meters underwater. It is pitch black. You are trapped in a cave so tight that you can't turn around, and your air tank has just run dry. You find a tiny, razor-thin pocket of air at the ceiling, just enough to keep you conscious, but not enough to save you. You know that in a few minutes, the water will fill your lungs. The agony of drowning is inevitable. So you look down at the dive knife strapped to your leg, and you make a choice that no human being should ever have to make. Welcome back to Pause Inside. Today, we're looking at two absolute nightmares of exploration that went horribly wrong. Our first story takes us to the stunning coast of Croatia. Just off the mainland sits Schulta Island. It's a small, idyllic place, only about 19 kilometers long, famous for its delicious honey, its pebble beaches, and absolutely crystal clear water. It's the perfect day trip from the city of Split. But beneath that beautiful turquoise surface lies a trap, an underwater cave that has a reputation for killing virtually everyone who dares to enter it without the right skills. On September 10, 2002, 31-year-old Miroslav Kukas was on vacation there with a group of friends. It was a relaxed evening, a little after 8:30 p.m., when the group got an idea. The water looked so inviting, even in the dark, that they decided to go scuba diving. Now, usually, night diving around Šolta is safe. You stick to the shallow alcoves, you look at some sleeping fish, and you stay in a controlled environment. But Miroslav and his friends weren't looking for a safe tourist dive. They had heard whispers about a specific underwater cave just south of the island, in Pogan Bay. They had heard it was dangerous. They had heard that only expert divers were allowed inside. But, tragically, they fell into that trap of overconfidence that catches so many of us. They were barely novice divers, but they thought, how bad can it really be? Let's just go check it out. They convinced a local boat driver to take them out to the bay, right over the spot where the cave entrance lay hidden beneath the waves. They geared up, hopped off the boat, and descended. About 10 meters down, they found it, a single dark hole in the seafloor. This was the only way in and the only way out. To enter, you have to go head first because the chimney is so tight. Once you drop through that entrance, you hit a junction about another 10 meters down. This is where things get complicated. To one side, you have the shallow gallery, a cavern that bottoms out at 36 meters. It's a dead end. If you go the other way, you enter the deep gallery, a massive chamber that plunges all the way down to 57 meters. And right at the top of that deep gallery, clinging to the ceiling rock, is a very thin, permanent air pocket. Now, aside from the depth, there is a specific reason why this cave is a death trap. The visibility is zero. The only natural light comes from that single entry hole, and it doesn't reach past the junction. Once you are in the galleries, it is ink black. But it gets worse. The walls and floor are caked in thick, loose silt. As soon as a diver enters, their flippers kick up this silt and it explodes into the water like a dust storm. Imagine driving down a highway in dense fog with your high beams on. The light just reflects back at you, blinding you. That's what it's like in there. You can have the brightest flashlight in the world, but once that silt is disturbed, you can't see your hand in front of your face. You are effectively diving blindfolded. Miroslav went in first, followed by his two friends. He reached the junction and turned toward the deep gallery. He descended all the way to the bottom, 57 meters down. He touched the floor, turned around, and began his ascent. But this is where the silt and the darkness disoriented him. He reached the junction, but instead of turning toward the exit, he made a critical error. He swam into the shallow gallery, thinking it was the way out. He likely swam until he bumped into a wall or ceiling. You can imagine the panic starting to set in. He's kicking, feeling around, churning up more mud. He realizes his mistake, turns around, and manages to find the junction again. But then, in his confusion, he missed the exit again. This time, he accidentally swam back into the deep gallery. Now, he's deep underwater, he's lost, and his air is running low. His dive computer would later show that he was fumbling around in that darkness for quite some time. At some point, Miroslav must have checked his gauge and realized the terrifying truth. He was out of air.
He made one last desperate push toward the ceiling, hoping to find the surface. But he didn't break the surface of the ocean. He hit rock. He had found that tiny air pocket at the top of the deep gallery. Stop and put yourself in his position for a moment. You are trapped in a small pocket of stale air, 40 or 50 meters beneath the surface. You can't breathe the water. You can't hold your breath long enough to swim out. The pressure is crushing down on you. The carbon dioxide is building up in your blood, making you gasp for air that isn't there.
Miroslav knew he only had a few minutes before he would pass out and drown. He knew exactly what drowning feels like: the panic, the thrashing, the burning in the lungs. It is a slow, terrifying way to die. Faced with that certainty, Miroslav made a decision that chills me to the bone. With a clarity that sometimes comes at the very end, he reached down and unsheathed his dive knife. He gripped the handle, steeled himself, and drove the blade into his own chest, piercing his heart. It was quick. He didn't want to suffer. When authorities eventually recovered him and performed the autopsy, they confirmed the unthinkable. Miroslav did not drown. He died by his own hand to escape the nightmare. The story gets even darker. While Miroslav was below, his friends had surfaced. They waited 10 minutes, 20, an hour. Panic turned to dread. They called the police, and a rescue team was dispatched. One of the divers sent to find him was 25-year-old Oliver Marich. He was a professional, fit, capable, and brave, but he didn't have experience with this specific cave. Oliver descended into that same silty black maze, and just like Miroslav, he got disoriented. He searched the gloom, likely fighting the poor visibility, until he too made a wrong turn. He got trapped in the shallow gallery, unable to find the junction. His partner managed to escape, but Oliver wasn't so lucky. He swam back and forth between the galleries, burning through his air, desperately looking for the way out. Eventually, his tank ran dry. Oliver Marich drowned in the same cave just hours after Miroslav had died. It took police 3 long days to navigate that labyrinth and recover both bodies. Today, local authorities warn everyone to stay away. Yet year after year, overconfident divers still go down there to test their luck. Our second story takes us away from the ocean and into the dry, dusty heart of the American Southwest. It was New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1990. 21-year-old Kevin Sears and a friend were heading into the Santa Rita Mountains, just south of Tucson, Arizona. They were headed for the Agua Caliente cave. Both of them were young, adventurous, and feeling pretty confident. They had explored a few caves before, and they had even been to this specific cave in the past. But that familiarity was dangerous. They weren't prepared for a major expedition. The weather outside was chilly, but they knew the cave stayed at a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit, so they just wore jeans and t-shirts. They wore tennis shoes instead of heavy boots, and crucially, neither of them wore a helmet. They carried flashlights and, slung over Kevin's shoulder, a 50-foot coil of polypropylene rope. They entered the cave at 11 a.m. through a tight squeeze in the hillside. For a while, things went smoothly. They crawled over rough stone, scraping their arms and knees, relying on their memory of the cave layout. They didn't have a map. Their plan was to do a loop, to go in the upper entrance, descend a vertical shaft known as the loop pit, and then exit through the lower opening so they wouldn't have to climb back up. They reached the loop pit quickly. It's a 40-foot drop to the lower level. Now, normally you'd use rappelling gear for this, but Kevin and his friend didn't have harnesses or figure eights. They just tied their rope to a rock, tugged on it to make sure it held, and lowered themselves down hand over hand. That takes a lot of strength, but they made it safely. They continued on, exploring narrow tunnels that opened up into larger rooms. By 1 p.m., they reached the White Sand Room. This is a signature spot in the cave with a floor covered in fine beach-like sand. This was supposed to be their waypoint. They started looking for the passage that would lead them to the exit, but they couldn't find it. They spent 30 minutes sweeping their flashlights over every crack and crevice. Every tunnel looked the same. The shadows played tricks on them. The rock formations seemed to shift. They were experiencing that terrifying phenomenon of getting turned around underground. The cave was becoming a maze. They realized they were lost. To make matters worse, their flashlights were starting to dim. The batteries were dying. They had to make a choice. They couldn't find the lower exit, so they had to admit defeat and go back the way they came. That meant they had to climb up that 40-foot rope at the loop pit. They retraced their steps, fatigue setting in. It took longer to get back than it did to get in. But finally, they saw the rope dangling in the dark. Kevin went first. He grabbed the rope and started to pull himself up, hand over hand, foot by foot. He was fighting gravity, his muscles burning, the rough fibers of the rope biting into his hands. He climbed up through the darkness, getting higher and higher. He was nearly at the top when he encountered a section of the wall covered in flowstone. Flowstone is a mineral deposit created by water over thousands of years. It is smooth, hard, and slippery as ice. Kevin's tennis shoes, now coated in cave dust, were useless against it. He scrambled for purchase, but there was no friction. His grip failed. Kevin plummeted backward into the dark. He fell 40 feet. Crashing onto the stone floor below. He instinctively wrapped his arms around his head to protect his skull. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving him gasping in the dust. He lay there for a moment, checking his body. Amazingly, he seemed okay. He was in pain, sure, but he could move. Adrenaline is a powerful thing. He stood up, shook it off, and walked back to the rope. He had to get out. He started the climb again. You can imagine how hard this must have been. He's already exhausted. He's just taken a massive fall, and his arms are trembling. But he pulled himself up, inch by inch. He reached that same treacherous section of flowstone near the top. He tried to be careful. He tried to find a foothold, but again, his feet slipped. This time, the fall was different. He didn't land cleanly. He hit the ground awkwardly, and a bolt of searing, white-hot pain exploded through his leg and hip. He collapsed onto the dusty floor, agony washing over him. He tried to stand, but his body screamed in protest. He couldn't put any weight on his leg. He was convinced he had fractured his femur, the biggest bone in the body, and possibly his pelvis. He was trapped. He couldn't move, let alone climb a 40-foot rope. His friend, realizing the severity of the situation, had to make the heartbreaking decision to leave him. He had to climb out solo to get help. Kevin was left alone in the absolute darkness. His flashlight eventually died completely. He lay there in the silence, in excruciating pain, not knowing if help would arrive in time. His friend made it out and found a phone. It wasn't until 3 p.m. that the emergency call went out. The Southern Arizona Rescue Association, experts in cave rescue, got the page at 7 p.m. By the time the first rescuers arrived at the cave, it was nightfall. They descended into the cave and found Kevin. He was conscious, but in bad shape. He had been lying on the cold rock for hours. The rescuers immediately went to work. They secured him to a backboard to immobilize his spine and leg. They started an IV to give him fluids, but they couldn't give him pain meds or water because they didn't know if he would need immediate surgery. Now, getting a healthy person out of a cave is hard. Getting an immobilized man on a rigid backboard is a nightmare of logistics. The rescue team had to build 4 separate mechanical pulley systems inside the cave. They had to haul him up the loop pit, then drag him through narrow squeezes like the beer can slide and up into the register room. It was slow, grueling work. They were literally inches at a time, shouting commands that echoed off the limestone walls. Kevin was belayed with safety lines the entire way to prevent another fall. As the clock struck midnight and the world rang in the new year, Kevin was still underground, strapped to a litter, being passed from hand to hand by exhausted rescuers. Finally, at 2 a.m. on New Year's Day, nearly 15 hours after he first entered the cave, Kevin was pulled through the lower entrance and into the biting winter air. He was airlifted to the University Medical Center, and here is the wildest part of the story. Doctors rushed him into imaging, expecting shattered bones, but after all the x-rays came back, they were shocked. Despite falling 40 feet twice, and despite the agonizing pain that made him unable to stand, Kevin hadn't broken a single bone. He was covered in massive, deep bruises and contusions. His body had taken a severe beating, but structurally, he was intact. He had miraculously avoided the fractures that usually come with a fall like that. Thank you for watching. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next video.